At the Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Support for the Nocturnist comes from the California Medical Association. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. Support for the Nocturnist also comes from the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. You're listening to the Nocturnist Conversations. I'm Emily Silverman. Let's face it, as much as our culture delights in talking about sex, we do not relish talking about the sexually transmitted infections which sometimes follow. But STIs are not just a fact of life. They're a topic that has been shrouded in mystery and moralizing throughout the history of medicine. Is it time for some straight talk? Today, I speak with Dr. Ina Park, a family medicine doctor, associate professor of family and community medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and the author of Strange Bedfellows, Adventures in the Science, History, and Surprising Secrets of STDs. I am sitting here with the wonderful Dr. Ina Park. Ina, thanks for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Emily.
I would love if you started us off by reading an excerpt from your amazing book, Strange Bedfellows.
Strange Bedfellows is my attempt to explore the role of STIs in our past, present, and future. It is a journey that goes from the microscopic clashing of two human microbiomes during sex to the big picture of sexual networks, appreciating the influence that just a few players have over the sexual health of the many. We'll meander through the twists and turns of real people's sex lives and debunk common wisdom about STIs. You'll meet my dear colleagues, a scrappy bunch of scientists and public health workers who have chosen to devote their lives to this field. Then I've thrown in the details of my own journey, the tale of a studious Korean girl who ended up spending her days between other people's legs for a living. This book is a peek into my weird and wonderful world, and I hope you will love it here as much as I do.
Thank you for reading that. And I have to ask, how did you get to be so passionate about STIs?
I got really excited about the topic at first at University of California, Berkeley, where I did my undergraduate work. And I started off as a sexual health peer educator. I had just noticed that I had become sort of a go-to person for my friends to talk about their sex lives with, and as well as the aftermath and testing and pap smears and whatever. And I think it's because I was pre-med and all of my friends were not, that I became the default go-to person. I joined this peer education group and I started actually doing post-test counseling around HIV as well as STIs, and then also counseling folks before they were going in for their first cervical cancer test or pelvic exam. And then I was also traipsing around to dorms and frat houses and sorority houses and whatnot, actually doing live demonstrations with plastic penises and condoms and doing condom distribution, which culminated on National Condom Day when I was a junior, where I dressed up as a huge condom from head to toe with just my face showing and did a demo in front of over 100 people at UC Berkeley with a banana and a condom and wrote about that. And that's how I got into medical school, actually, believe it or not.
I love this image of you standing in front of a crowd, head to toe in a condom outfit. And one of the things I love about this book is how you bring a sense of joy and play to the topic of sex and STIs, which is so important because it's a topic that's so covered with shame and stigma. And I guess what I'm wondering is, why do you think there is such shame and stigma associated with this topic?
I feel like at least my sex education coming up through my secondary school years was more abstinence focused. And when you are more abstinence focused, then if that abstinence is the ideal, then having sex is not ideal. And then certainly if you end up with a consequence of sex, such as an STI, well, then you're getting sort of your just desserts for violating, you know what I mean? This idea that we have about having sex before marriage as being some sort of sin. So I think societally, there are a lot of issues related to our views on sex. I think we have sort of an unhealthy view of it and don't think of it as sort of a natural part of development. When I was coming up through my middle school sex education, we were shown lots of pictures of STIs and the worst case scenarios around them. And so I feel like that set us up for the fact that if you actually got an STI, that you should feel ashamed, that you might get rejected from a partner because they might think that you were quote unquote unclean. So I think it really starts early. And so I think those attitudes are very difficult to change, which is why I was very intentional about creating sort of a joyful, light, and funny approach to the topic.
Yeah, I feel like when I was in middle school, we also focused on the bad parts of sex and didn't really talk about the positive aspects of sex and the joy and the pleasure and things like consent and things like that. So it definitely resonates. And actually, some of my favorite chapters in the book, which were also some of the most unexpected, were the ones where you explore the culture of sex. So you write a lot about sex toys, the rabbit and how it appeared in Sex and the City. You write about pubic hair, Brazilian waxing, vagina bedazzling.
Right.
You write about vaginal steaming and the jade eggs and that whole controversy.
Right.
Was it fun to dive down this rabbit hole of the culture of sex? And what were some of your takeaways from that part of the journey?
Oh, it was great because, as you know, Emily, sometimes your professional interests bleed into your personal interests. So, I think sex is fascinating anyway. And we were talking about sort of my origins with the whole sexual health thing. I remember spending a lot of time because we had educators from Good Vibrations, which is, for those listening, it's a local sex toy store in the Bay Area as well as in Boston. And I've always, been interested in sex and pleasure as well. So those parts of the book were the most fun to write. The things that were really painful and difficult were writing about topics that were so serious, so heavily stigmatized, and trying to write them with sort of a light hand and try to still infuse humor without making fun of something, because the last thing I would want to do is for people to feel more stigmatized than they already do.
Yes, and I was very impressed by the research that you did. You even took a trip to Brazil to try out and understand Brazilian waxing. So, I mean, when you did that, were you thinking to yourself, okay, I'm going to write a book about all these different things, so I'm going to go do this now? Or was it more like, oh, I've already done these things, so now I'm going to piece them together retrospectively?
Our International STD Research Society has a meeting every 2 years. And when I heard it was going to be in Brazil, and I knew I was going to be writing about pubic hair, just because I had started noticing that none of my patients had any, and I was really interested in exploring that phenomenon, but possibly because of the career that I chose, I just haven't had time to deal with my own pubic grooming. And so I said, well, there's no better place to get your hair taken off than by the people who know how to do it well, which is the Brazilians. Because for folks who haven't been to Brazil, the swimsuits in Rio are like little strips of fabric that barely cover the orifices that they're supposed to be covering. So the Brazilians are very good at depilation. And I was very intentional about having that piece. And I wrote a lot of that chapter when I was there, actually doing it in real time.
And I love how you look at these questions through the lens of science and you don't really cast judgment for or against. You just talk about, this is what's happening. These are the trends. This is what's backed by science.
Right.
This is what's not. This is what could be harmful.
Right.
I wanted to pivot a bit and talk about STIs because that's obviously the focus of the book. And one of the most striking moments was when you compare these two anecdotes. So first, we meet a guy who has a girlfriend in Nevada and a girlfriend in California, and he has sex with them back and forth. And then we meet another guy who lives in one city but has 25 different partners in the last 3 months. And you tell us that it's actually the first guy who ended up getting tested and having an STI and the second guy who tested negative. And then you go on to explain to us why the number of people you have sex with actually doesn't have as much to do with your risk of contracting STIs as you would think. So can you explain to us a little bit about how this works?
Part of the issue comes down to how you engage in sexual relationships. The patient who had had 25 partners but had not ended up with anything was actually sort of being serially monogamous, even though some of these relationships were only lasting like a day or a week or whatever, is that he was having sex with one person, ending the relationship, having sex with the next person, ending the relationship. And so it was happening sequentially like that. Whereas the person who was having the relationships with the two women was ping-ponging back and forth between them. And I talk about the fact that actually having concurrent relationships or being in a community where there's lots of concurrent relationships happening is actually what fuels the spread of STIs and HIV, by the way. Whereas if people are serially monogamous, especially if they're testing in between partners, then actually that's a much less efficient way to transmit STIs. But one thing I just wanted to point out, Emily, is that I know you guys have done a lot of work around racial equity on your podcast, is just that in some communities, especially for folks who are heterosexual, that men are either incarcerated or missing from the population due to violence. And there are literally in some communities not enough men to go around for all of the women that want to have sex with men. And therefore, we end up in a situation where concurrency is driven by the fact that there are literally not enough community members to go around for everyone to have just one partner. And that is part of the reason why Black Americans are more likely to catch STIs such as gonorrhea, not because of different sexual practices, not because of differences in condom use, but simply because of this idea of concurrency that is forced because of these structural racial issues such as mass incarceration. So it's like, you don't think about gonorrhea being tied to mass incarceration, but I've tried to bring you there, you know what I mean, through my storytelling.
You really did bring me there, and it was just so heartbreaking to see how all of these different pieces of society are connected, from the medical to the legal and all of those other parts.
Yeah, so I think what it means on a policy perspective is like we really have to double down in communities of color, in funding organizations that are doing this kind of sexual health work in affected communities. And it just means that we really need to focus resources even more heavily because we have to try harder to reach folks because of medical mistrust as well, and just simply because there's more concurrency and more infections. So we need to work harder to control them.
And you talk about how public health researchers actually have these giant maps. In my mind, I was imagining like Minority Report, like spinning around this three-dimensional map where you said they almost look like dandelion blossoms.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about these maps. How do they work and how do people use them to track down and control STIs?
I feel like everybody who's listening is going to be familiar with contact tracing now, but at the time that I was writing that chapter, a lot of people weren't. But those maps you're talking about are really mapping people's sexual connections. So those people that look like little dandelion blowballs, they call them, are in the center, and then some of them have dozens and dozens of little spikes coming out, which represent all of their sexual partners. In a span of like a year or 2 years or whatever time period you choose, there's going to be connections between all of these people, some of whom have many sexual connections, some of whom have very few sexual connections. But you can actually see that over time, a lot of people actually are sexually connected with just 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And that there are really key people in a community that actually bridge high-risk networks together or bridge a high-risk network to a low-risk network, and therefore are able to spread STIs or HIV from one community to another. And so the whole idea around contact tracing, which, by the way, the whole concept of contact tracing started for syphilis back in the 30s, is to try to disrupt connections, right? By getting people and seeing who is the person that might have infected you upstream and who are the people that you may have infected downstream, and trying to interrupt those chains of transmission. And as you know, that for COVID-19, we had a really difficult time because I think things got out of hand before we could really nip things in the bud. And we have seen as well in CDC's preliminary data prior to the pandemic that we were in the same situation with STIs, including syphilis, for which we do lots of contact tracing still in the United States.
And you talk about how there are individuals in the middle of the dandelion blossoms and how they're called core transmitters.
Yes.
And it's somebody, I can't remember if it's your voice or a quote in the book, says, I prefer not to think of these people as high risk. I prefer to think of these people as affectionate, alluring, and charismatic. You can just feel it when you're in the room with them.
That was actually one of the contact tracers, and he's great. His name is Charles Phan, and he said, You are in the room with them and he's like, wow, I feel this allure or this kind of sex appeal thing, even though he's very professional. But what he's saying is that some people who end up crossing his desk over and over, he's like, this person is really charming and charismatic, and I can see why lots of people want to sleep with them. And he said, it's not because they are necessarily the most physically attractive, hunky person or whatnot, but it's really because he was saying that some people are very good at putting people at ease. And with sex, it can be a little bit awkward, right? So he said people that are good at putting other people at ease in the bedroom tend to have lots of sex and can sometimes end up with lots of STIs, depending on what type of networks they're playing in.
You mentioned contact tracing, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the sex detectives.
Yes.
Which you talk about how they're in some ways closet anthropologists, closet ethnographers, and they're really embedded in the community. And you talk about one person who showed up at a sex party to do some testing and then took a soak in the hot tub on the way out.
Yep.
And you talk about another person who gave out his cell phone number to the community, and then often his kids would be fielding calls from sex workers who were calling the house with questions. So tell us a little bit more about this. Is this a lost art? Do we still have these STI detectives out in the community who are embedded and they really know people and they track them down? Or is this something of the past?
I think with this increasing move towards meeting partners digitally and with the pandemic, contact tracing has had to be performed primarily online and not in person. The heyday of that sort of in person, just sort of hanging out at places of interest was really in the 70s and to a lesser extent in the 80s. But once we hit the mid 90s and the rise of chat rooms and then obviously it's smartphone and apps, a lot of the contact tracing has to be done online. And don't get me wrong, I'll just use an example from the city of San Francisco when there was a pregnant woman who had syphilis and she was not housed. And the contact tracers went out, found the community where she was living under a freeway overpass and found partners, got them tested. So there's still this whole outreach component to contact tracing, and there always will be. But I think just because of the nature of the beast and the fact that right now we're so limited in terms of what we can do in person, that some of this whole online and digital contact tracing is going to be here to stay.
And you talk about how sometimes the social media dating apps will actually reach out to people to let them know they have an STI.
Well, you know what some health departments have been able to do, which I think is really cool, Emily, is that they are able to create their own profile on an app such as Grindr or Tinder. And so you will get a message, an in-app message from the health department saying, hey, not looking for a date, just letting you know that you may have been exposed to something. Come on in and get tested. Here's the places you can get tested. So serving as a resource. And for the most part, they try to use something that makes them look like an institution. But for some of the apps, they required like an actual headshot. One person I talked to was saying, I think people may get a shock because they're like, oh, this guy's really cute. And then you're like, oh, wait, they actually are telling me I have an STI. They don't actually want to go out with me. So that would be a highly disappointing interaction, I think, on an app.
Yeah, and there's a story in there about how someone was diagnosed with something and they were asked, who are your partners? And they said, I don't know his name, but here's his photo.
Right.
And they looked at the photo and he was standing in front of a gym. So they went to the gym and then they actually set up a table of pamphlets that was like about a different topic.
Yeah. It was a bike helmets. And then they just sat there and cased the joint for 2 or 3 hours. And then they saw the person walk in, but they didn't even know his name. They really just had the picture from the app's profile. And they said, well, we know he goes to this gym in downtown San Francisco. So we're just going to case the joint until we see that person. And then they casually sauntered up to them and said, hey, let's pull you back into a room here at the gym. And, you have syphilis. And that person was really quite surprised and taken aback. But this is like the extent of the detective work that's done. I mean, these folks are amazing. And I'm super curious because I know you have lots of physicians who listen to the Nocturnist as well as other healthcare providers. Were contact tracers something that you were familiar with before the whole COVID-19 pandemic? Had you interacted with them as a clinician before?
I had never interacted with a contact tracer as a clinician before. The contact tracing specifically, I wasn't familiar with until COVID-19. And then we learned that there were all these people around the city, librarians and other furloughed workers who were coming together to become contact tracers for the first time. So maybe that is a workforce that could be mobilized in the future, not just during pandemics, but for STI work.
Well, that's my hope, right? We invested so much in public health infrastructure because we had to during this time. And then my fear is that if that funding completely goes away, that all of those folks will then also lose their jobs. And I really think that some folks who were doing COVID-19 contact tracing and learned all those skills about interviewing and eliciting information could really be repurposed into doing work around STIs. I don't know if they're the same intersection of people. The people that love STI work may not be the same people who want to do COVID-19 contact tracing, but I think if we could, it would really go a long ways in terms of addressing the epidemic because people are already starting to have sex again. So I think the whole STI thing is going to blow up.
You talk in the book about all the different success stories with STIs. So you talk about penicillin for syphilis, you talk about antibiotics for gonorrhea, you talk about pap smears and HPV and how the rates of cervical cancer have plummeted, which is all really good news. Mm-hmm. But then you said something really interesting, which is that now, in some ways, teenagers have come to see STIs as kind of no big deal, like almost as if they're inevitable. Mm-hmm. And there's this fatalism around them, like, oh, if I get it, it's no big deal. I'll just take antibiotics and call it a day. Mm-hmm. And you say in the book that fatalism is a double-edged sword. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was a really interesting conundrum.
Yeah, one of the people that I interview is named Maria Trent, and she studies, mostly African-American young women in Baltimore, and she was reflecting that we are towing this very fine line. We want to destigmatize these infections. We want to normalize the fact that almost everybody is going to get an STI at some point in their sexual lives. And we also want people to take it seriously because the truth is, of course, that if you have untreated STIs, especially chlamydia or gonorrhea, for folks who have reproductive potential, like they can ascend into the upper genital tract and cause pelvic inflammatory disease, scarring, ectopic pregnancy, and all of these negative consequences. And yet, I also want people to feel sex positive and feel like they're empowered about their sexual health. So I am towing this very fine line, and I don't know exactly what the most effective message is. But I think what I'm trying to say right now is really, I'm more on the side of normalizing the fact that almost everyone will get these infections, and not to say that you shouldn't take them seriously, but the way I want to frame it is that people should take charge of their sexual health, knowing that there can be negative consequences, to be tested regularly, for example. But you're right. Some of Maria Trent's patients are like, everyone I know has had chlamydia, so I don't really care. I'm not going to take it seriously. I don't feel anything. So why should I actually spend my time going and seeking care and getting treated for something that does not have any symptoms? So she's really also towing that line of trying to explain the consequences without scaring people. And I think that's what we have to do in general as providers.
Right, because there's been so much stigma around it, so we definitely don't want to create fear. But at the same time, we do want people to have a healthy respect for STIs.
For the things that we fear or the things that we have an aversion to, we turn away from them, right? We are repulsed by them. We run away. So I think for something like STIs or any topic that is really highly stigmatized, I think that stories can draw people in, and I think that stories can break down stigma, which is why I think it's so important to use storytelling when we're talking about this and other stigmatized topics.
Yeah, you talk about storytelling in the book and how it's powerful, but that power can actually be wielded in a negative way. And you use the example of HPV vaccine deniers. And you said, I think all it took was 5 to 10 minutes of an ordinary person reading a heartbreaking story on a website that had an anti-vax flavor before they changed their minds. So how do you think about that? Like, are we just bad at using storytelling and the anti-vaxxers are good at using storytelling?
I've thought about this, and I think what you're doing with the Nocturnists and really having stories lead in the educational piece around different aspects of medicine, I think that's actually less common than what we typically do, especially with each other, is that we are using data and we basically show each other a lot of charts and figures, and we talk about results from studies and statistical significance. And the truth is that for the public, and when we're trying to do things related to public health, nobody cares about that. And what is more convincing to people are actual people's stories. So if you go to a government website and you see a lot of data and figures, and 1 in 4 people will have this, that, or the other, and then you go to a website with an anti-vax flavor, as you put it, and you read a heartbreaking story of how someone had a terrible consequence that they think is related to the HPV vaccine, what is going to stick with you? Those data pieces or this really compelling and heartbreaking story? Well, I know the answer for me, and I'm a parent. And so when we talk about people whose minds are changed by an anti-vaccine website, we're talking mostly about parents here. And those are the people making the decisions around vaccination for their children. So I actually think that we need to do more of what the anti-vax folks are doing, but using stories that are rooted in science.
Speaking of stories, one of the stories I love most in this book is the story of you sitting on a plane in Las Vegas next to this woman. And you had this really funny line where you were like, this was clearly a very religious woman. And here I was, a pro-choice mother heading to educate prison populations about STDs.
Right?
And the woman turns to you and she says, what do you do and why are you traveling? And you hesitate.
Right.
So tell us what happened next.
Well, so that plane time, like before you going to a conference, is like this sacred time where like nobody can email you or bother you. And I'm always worried that if I tell the truth about what I do to somebody I'm sitting next to who's going to judge it, then I'm going to ruin my relaxing me time. You know what I mean? And so I always just wonder, do I want to go there? And do I feel like I have the energy to defend myself if I need to? But I could not believe this woman's reaction. I mean, she's literally wearing a sweatshirt that is airbrushed that says Jesus saves on it, and she's wearing a cross. And I was like, I don't know how my information is going to land on them. But she was so into it. And then she whispered at me, I had sex before I was married. And I said, me too. And then we just started talking because she's the mother of 2 kids. And she said, I fully expect my children to have sex before they get married. I would really prefer that they did so that they knew what they were getting into. And I thought it was a really beautiful way for folks who were diametrically opposed on abortion rights and political leanings or whatnot to make a shared bridge over the fact that we wanted our kids both to be really sexually healthy. And I feel like we're missing all those little opportunities right now because we're not traveling together, we're not interacting with each other, and we are just yelling at each other from our echo chambers on social media. But that is a perfect example, I feel like, of how she probably got off that plane with maybe a different view of sexual health as well as STIs. And I got off that plane with a different view of what a Bible study leader who teaches Zumba might think about my field and what we do. So it was great. It was actually one of the first things I wrote in this book and one of the last things that actually went into the chapter in the end.
Yeah, I love that moment of connection between you and her and how you said it defied my preconceived notions. And that is what storytelling does for us.
It does.
In the book, you talk about this concept of sexual health. And I want to talk about that for a minute. And as we're talking about it, there's a sentence I wanted to hone in on, which I highlighted like 3 times in the book, which is that Americans have a basic embarrassment around acknowledging that we, our parents, our friends, and our children are sexual beings. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think acknowledging the fact that sex is normal and that we are all, for the most part, sexual beings. Of course, I want to acknowledge that some people are asexual and happy that way, but for most of us, we are sexual beings, and just acknowledging that is the very first step to being sexually healthy. Because if we acknowledge that that is normal and okay, and doesn't always have to be done in the heteronormative confines of a man and woman marriage, right? I think we will go a long way in starting to understand that there is a lot that comes along with sexual health, not just the simple act of penetration, whatever type you like, but all the issues that you and I talked about a little bit before we started the podcast around consent, around pleasure, and then, of course, the unintended consequences of sex like STIs and HIV and other infections. And then, of course, pregnancy and contraception. I mean, there's so much that's there. But if we don't even acknowledge that it's normal and we don't even begin to talk about it, then we can't even open that door to sexual health because we're just stuck at it's something that I do, it's private, I don't talk about it, I don't explore it, I don't discuss it, and I don't discuss it with my kids. And then we get stuck in the patterns that we're in right now. I think we carry this with us, those of us who work in healthcare, into medicine sometimes. And then some of us actually could break this down with patients. But sometimes even those of us who do work in the healthcare space actually have a hard time talking about it ourselves. You may feel pretty comfortable with it, but I'm curious to hear your experience and if you know about some of your colleagues as well who might have a hard time talking about sex.
Yeah, it's not the easiest thing to talk about. I think I'm pretty comfortable talking about it, but I imagine there are others who aren't as comfortable. I still remember as a medical student doing the pelvic exam on the standardized patients.
Yes.
And I loved, by the way, that part of your book where you're the standardized patient for the pelvic exam because the original person got her period and wasn't feeling well. And so you stood in for her, right?
That was my debut and my closing night they call them now gynecologic teaching associates. That was my one and only time. But yes, I have done a live pelvic exam in front of an audience.
And one of your students fainted.
Yes. He fainted, and I'm so curious to know if he's actually a gynecologist out there somewhere now. I would love to know that. I don't have anything dramatic going on with my vulva or cervix or anything like that. I just think he had never seen an exam, and I think just to see one with someone he knew as the model, and the room was too warm. I mean, there were so many things that just set him up. But yes, he was on the floor, and I was in stirrups with no pants on, so I couldn't help him, so everybody else had to rush to his aid.
Yeah, that was just such a funny story. And I think an extreme example of just how uncomfortable people are in the presence of these conversations and in the presence of these body parts.
Right.
And in medical school, they teach you how to take a sexual history. And I remember when I was a student, they taught us one way. And today I feel like they teach it very differently.
Yes.
We were taught to ask, do you sleep with men, women, or both?
Right.
And now I realize there are many other ways of asking.
Right.
And I think that's the other piece of it too, is the conversation around sexual orientation and gender identity has become very, very murky. And I think sometimes people trip up over these topics because they don't want to say the wrong thing.
Know.
They don't want to offend. Yep. And so, yeah, for all of these reasons, it can be difficult to talk about. And the way that you talk about it, which is so easy breezy, really inspires me. I mean, do you think you can teach that? Like, can you teach someone that comfort?
Well, so I don't know that you can teach the comfort, but can we just say, can you fake it till you make it? You know what I mean? I think we can teach you how to say the words. And can I just give a little plug because CDC will be putting out like a revised guide to taking a sexual history? Because I was also in the school of men, women, or both. And now obviously we can ask just to put words in people's mouths if you want to say, what is the gender of your sex partners? So leave it more open-ended so that someone could say, oh, I have a partner who's non-binary or a partner who's trans or whatever, and just acknowledging the fact that there are more genders than just male and female. So I think we can teach people the words to say. What people's internal experiences of comfort may or may not get there. But I think it's like with anything else, the more you practice, the better that you get at it. And I know some people don't ask at all, because I've had patients say to me, no one's ever asked me that. And I was like, what do you mean? No one's ever asked you. So I know that some people are just not going there because they don't know what to say. So I'm really hopeful that if we put out more guides on a national level to say, here are some examples of language you can use, that even if you don't feel comfortable using it, at least you can say the words. And people appreciate it. Your patients really appreciate it.
You mentioned earlier talking to kids about sex,
Mm-hmm.
and your kids make all of these humorous appearances throughout the book. There's one scene where your two children are fighting over this curly stuffed animal, and it's a syphilis stuffed animal,
Mm-hmm.
and they're arguing over who gets to have syphilis.
Right.
And you talk about how the conversation about sex is really difficult these days because there's so many different topics to cover, like hookup apps and consent and pornography and masturbation and pleasure and STIs and HIV and sexual orientation and gender identity.
Right.
Like there's just so many different
Right.
dimensions to it. And for you, since you're an expert, it's probably pretty easy. But for other folks, how do you recommend that they talk to their kids about sex and STIs?
I actually refer folks to a website through teensource.org. It's literally called talkwithyourkids.org. What it does that I think is helpful, it lays out a timeline of here's the age at which you could potentially talk about the following topics. And it also even gives some sample language. Like we were saying before, like, I'm not comfortable, but I'm going to fake it and pretend that I am. And so I think that is helpful, because I think as a parent, it's super overwhelming. Like, when do I talk about which topic and what do I say? My friend Peggy Orenstein talks about this in both of her books, about talking with the kids in the car so you don't have to make eye contact, and just simply opening the door by even mentioning those topics. Like the fact that I mentioned the word masturbation to my son, even though he doesn't want to talk about it now, he may come around and actually he knows that the door is open. And that actually happened. My 13-year-old asked me about it yesterday. I brought it up like the year before, and he covered his ears with his hands and said, I can't hear you. I'm not listening. And then yesterday he came around and asked me about it. You don't have to know the answer to everything either. You can also say, can we put a pin in that and let me come back around to it? And then you can actually get educated yourself online. But it's super important to break it up. It's not one talk. You don't get to have the talk. It's like 36 little talks. But you have time, and something like talkwithyourkids.org can help organize when I'm going to talk about everything.
At the end of the book, you talk about Michael Pollan and his manifesto, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And you go on a search for a manifesto of your own, which proves difficult.
Yep.
And what you come up with at the end is have sex with people that you like.
Uh-huh.
So tell us, how did you come up with that? And what does that do? Especially that piece at the end, people that you like.
I tried to make it just like Michael Pollan's. His is eat food, right? Not too much, mostly plants. So I wanted to say like have sex, not too much. And then I kind of failed at the mostly plants thing, you know what I mean? So then I had to scrap that, and I wanted to come up with something short. And I came up with two things. Number one, this whole idea that I was raised with was you can't have sex until you're married. That's what I was told. So meaning like you can only have sex with people that you love. And we just know that that's a very high bar to set for sex, can I just say? So I can't give that advice because that's not what I've always done myself. And I think if you have sex with people that you like, or at least someone that you know something about, then if an STI enters the picture, you're just better equipped to deal with it. And I think you're less likely to feel a ton of regret. What I've noticed as well, like especially folks that are having casual sex where there isn't like this huge love investment, that at least if they think the person is a decent person, that they are better able to cope with an STI diagnosis. The people that have the most regret or who are the most upset say to me, oh my God, like I don't even know that person's name. I don't remember anything about them and I cannot believe now I have to deal with this. Or that person is kind of an a-hole or a jerk and I don't know why I slept with them, but I was just bored or lonely. And so having sex with people that you find at least something redeeming about, I think doesn't shield you from STIs, but I think it might shield you a little bit from regret. And isn't that what we're trying to do in life in general? It's just like trying to live without regrets.
Yes, definitely. I could not agree more. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here today, Ina. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience that we haven't touched on?
So 2 things. So just to wrap up the whole Michael Pollan thing, my friend actually sent that section of the book to Michael Pollan, and he thought it was funny, and he came up with, have sex, not too much, and mostly humans. But I told him, like, that's too kinky even for me. So I'm not putting it in. But I thought that was a great idea on his part. Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably interesting for people to know that in January of 2021, the CDC released some new estimates that 1 in 5 of us actually has an STI right now. So just, I want folks to stew on that and just realize how incredibly common these are. And we're all going to get at least HPV and probably at least one other STI in our lifetimes. So they've been around with us ever since human beings have been having sex. So they're not going anywhere and we just need to get used to them and learn how to live with them.
Well, I just can't recommend this book enough. It's smart, it's funny, It's super educational. And for anybody who's interested in women's health, OBGYN, reproductive rights, LGBTQ, there's just so much in here. So check it out. It's called Strange Bedfellows, Adventures in the Science, History, and Surprising Secrets of STDs. Dr. Ina Park, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, thank you, Emily. It was so great.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Nocturnist Conversations was produced by Head of Story Development Adelaide Papazoglou and edited and mixed by Jon Oliver. Our executive producer is Allie Block, our director of operations is Rebecca Groves, and our original music is from Yosef Monroe. Additional music is from Blue Dot Sessions. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. The Nocturnist is also made possible by the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. If you've enjoyed listening, give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. To contribute your voice to one of our upcoming projects or to make a donation to support our work, visit our website at thenocturnist.com. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. See you next time.